The preview developments for the Thursday, February 19th episode of Beyond the Gates center on a heated argument between Leslie and Anita right in the middle of the country club, an encounter that spirals into unfortunate consequences for Anita. Meanwhile, Elon teaches Jacob the art of deep infiltration into an organization, and Naomi catches Haley off guard. Key points to remember. The conflict between Leslie and Anita at the country club becomes public and deeply personal. Elon offers Jacob harsh, uncompromising advice about the risks of undercover work and long-term infiltration. Naomi surprises Haley as relationships at Fairmont Crest begin to shift. Lunch at the country club should have been a rare pause in the exhausting stretch of days Anita has been enduring. But from the moment she stepped into that polished, luxurious space, the warm golden lights and the clink of glass could not conceal the heaviness clinging to every breath. Vernon chose this place believing its elegance and privacy might help his wife forget, if only briefly, the frightening test results lying quietly in a drawer at home. He held onto a calm smile and tried to convince himself that if Anita could eat a little today, laugh a little, then perhaps the illness remained at some hazy boundary, not yet fully inside their lives. But Vernon underestimated something else that could be just as dangerous as disease. Wounded pride and the bitterness accumulating inside a woman who had just survived a lonely Valentine's Day like Leslie. Leslie appeared on the other side of the room with the posture of someone searching for a target, someone close enough to absorb her rage. She had once hoped Valentine's Day would not end with her sitting alone. She had allowed herself the illusion that Marcel might break routine, abandon work, and choose her for one night. Yet life reminded Leslie again that she belonged to no man, that her place was always secondary, an option kept nearby when they needed a moment of entertainment, or when her sharpness could be used in murky situations. That cruel reality turned even more sour when she had to watch Shanice and Ted glowing beside one another, and when she had to endure Donnie Shanice and Anita's daughter standing tall and driving her out of Uptown with a contemptuous look. Humiliation like that does not dissolve overnight. It compresses, molten and scalding, waiting for a moment to spill and burn whoever stands too close. When Leslie recognized Anita and Vernon seated at an inner table, her first instinct was not to avoid them but to walk straight toward them. In Leslie's eyes, Anita embodied everything she did not have: a woman cushioned by family, reputation, and even illness, as if protected by an invisible wall. For Leslie, even Anita's suffering carried a privilege she could not tolerate. Anita had the right to collapse and still be caught, to have someone like Vernon willing to sacrifice to preserve her dignity. Leslie, by contrast, imagined herself falling onto cold tile, surrounded only by curious stares and judgment. That injustice pushed her forward like a windstorm, and before she fully realized it, she was standing beside Anita's table. Anita had already been tense since morning, staring at herself in the mirror and applying extra powder to hide the pallor that was becoming harder to disguise. She did not want anyone at the club to see weakness. For Anita, hiding the illness was not mere vanity, it was the only way to keep power balanced within her family and within the community. If people learned she had cancer, conversations would change, eyes would shift, and decisions inside the Dupree household would begin quietly slipping out of her hands. She could not bear the thought of Vernon, Donnie, or anyone else starting to treat her as a burden to protect rather than a pillar with authority. She feared the disease would not only eat at her body, but gnaw away her voice, her presence, her position. When Leslie opened her mouth to attack, Anita felt each sentence like a needle driving into the very place she was struggling to cover. Leslie's sarcasm, insinuations, and probing remarks about how Anita always acted superior and always had family surrounding her, all of it circled one vicious message: a woman like Anita, with the perfect life everyone admired, would never understand what it meant to be abandoned, to be treated as excess. Anita knew Leslie had no idea about her illness, but those careless words landed precisely on the fears Anita had buried deepest. The room suddenly blurred at the edges. The clinking of cutlery seemed to recede. For a moment, It felt as if the air had been pulled entirely from her chest. Vernon noticed a change so small yet unmistakable. The shift in Anita's eyes, the slight tremor in the hand resting on her napkin. He could see Leslie savoring the cruelty of forcing Anita to maintain composure in public, skating along the line between insult and feigned concern. Vernon wanted to stand, to cut it off, but he was trapped between two fears. The fear that Anita would collapse right here if things went any further. And the fear of watching his wife lose the proud poise he loved right in front of the people, always waiting to whisper. He had promised to be a shield for her against any storm, and now he found himself forced to sit still, sweating at his forehead, praying the storm would pass without taking something that could never be recovered. But Anita's body had its own limits. The strain from endless appointments, half-finished conversations with doctors about possible spread to other organs. The nights without sleep because she feared waking to a new kind of pain, all of it had placed her on a ledge she did not fully recognize. The confrontation with Leslie was only the final shove. When Anita stood, perhaps trying to escape the poison closing in around her, her legs suddenly felt foreign. Dizziness slammed into her like a severed wire between mind and body, and before she could do anything, she stumbled and fell in the middle of the club's pristine elegance. The soft gasp, the scrape of chairs, the collective turn of eyes toward her, everything became the scene Anita had spent months trying to prevent. And then the worst happened. In the chaos called for a doctor, Vernon's panic, someone mentioning medical history, someone referencing Anita's cancer monitoring information slipped out like an accidental collision, but loud enough for the entire room to hear. Leslie, for a second, saw Anita's face drained of color and understood she had struck something she never anticipated, but guilt did not arrive right away. It was shoved aside by Leslie's survival instinct, by the reflex of a woman who had long believed life was too cruel to leave her room for softness. Deep down, she still saw herself as the victim, and watching everyone's concern rush toward Anita while she remained the outsider, she clenched her hands, feeling, absurdly, as though fate was again favoring that other woman, even in pain. Anita was taken for emergency evaluation, and this time the doctor had no choice but to urge her to be fully transparent with her family about the state of her illness. The signs suggested the disease might be advancing faster than expected, with an increased risk of spreading elsewhere. That meant the powerful facade Anita had forced herself to maintain was beginning to shatter. She was not only battling physical pain, she was being pushed to accept that the entire story of power, image, and control in her family could pivot the moment people stopped seeing her as unbreakable. Inside, Anita was furious at Leslie and furious at herself for hiding the truth too long, only to have the secret explode in the most humiliating, uncontrolled way possible. Meanwhile, on a completely different front, Jacob wrestled with another kind of tension, quieter, but no less brutal. He stepped into his undercover assignment with fierce conviction that this was his chance to prove himself. To no longer be viewed as Ellen's son, but as a real detective willing to do the hardest work for justice. But between idealism and reality is a gap only those who enter darkness can truly feel. Elon knew that gap well. Beneath the cold exterior of a commanding officer was a father carrying a persistent dread that his son would go too far, not only in the mission, but in the internal transformation it would demand. Elon tried to teach Jacob the brutal truths of infiltration. Once you go deep into a criminal organization, there is no room for impulsive reactions, no room for emotional ties that make you hesitate. Yet each warning, however grounded in experience, crashed into an invisible wall: Jacob's hunger for respect. He was tired of being overprotected, tired of every decision measured by whether it was safe through the lens of a father. The more he was cautioned, the more he wanted to prove he could endure pressure, that he did not need favors. But pride, especially the kind that feels constantly tested, can push a person into corners they will later find impossible to escape. Jacob's decision to move out in order to protect Naomi became a turning point he saw both as a necessary sacrifice and as a deep cut into his marriage. He told himself the separation was strategy, a way to keep Naomi from becoming leverage if the organization discovered his family weakness. But the obsession with maintaining his cover slowly trained him to see everything through suspicion. Instead of calling Naomi to comfort her, he calculated how many calls were enough to keep her from panicking, but not enough to attract attention if someone monitored him. The relationship began to be treated like a variable in a case file, not a living bond held together by genuine intimacy. On the other side of that new distance, Naomi fought an emptiness she could barely name. She understood Jacob's work and the possibility that this assignment could be a major opportunity for his career, but understanding did not make it easy to accept. Each night, staring at the space where Jacob once slept, Naomi felt pushed aside not only from her husband's daily life, but from the decisions shaping their shared future. Her confusion deepened because she carried a secret of her own, the fact that she carried the BRCA gene. She did not want to burden Jacob, yet she could not bring herself to speak. Terrified he might look at her differently, like a man forced to choose between a dangerous mission and a wife facing long-term medical uncertainty. Keeping that secret filled Naomi with guilt, but it also gave her a fragile sense of control. In a world where she had to watch Jacob step into darkness she could not manage, withholding information about her own body became the only thing she truly held in her hands. Still, the strain grew as she imagined Jacob learning from another source. If medical records leaked, if a doctor misspoke, if someone at the hospital mentioned it casually, how would Jacob react? Would he feel betrayed, or would he slip instantly into control mode, making decisions for Naomi about treatment, about the future, about having children? As if she were another case he needed to handle. Naomi's presence at the hospital, where Haley was brought after the robbery, unintentionally pulled her into a new labyrinth of secrets and suspicion. At first, she was simply there, a familiar face connected through family ties, witnessing the aftermath of what seemed like a random crime. But Naomi's instincts as a lawyer would not let her ignore the small details in reports, in testimony, in the silences Haley left behind. Something did not align, certain blurred edges in the story of how the robbery unfolded, what the attacker truly wanted, why the missing ring mattered. Naomi began questioning not only Haley's safety, but the hidden players behind the event, the connections no one was naming. The closer Naomi got to Haley, the more the line between compassion and caution blurred. Part of her wanted to soften, to believe the robbery was simply a painful accident and that Haley deserved protection. But another part, sharpened by legal training, could not look away from the fractures in the narrative. Naomi felt an urge to control the situation growing inside her. She knew that choosing to stand with Haley meant choosing to drift closer to a whirlpool stirred by Bill, Lynette, and other unseen shadows. And inside that whirlpool, Naomi's BRCA secret and her fragile, half-separated marriage to Jacob could become cards others might use against her. Within that broader tension, Lynette emerged like a con artist running out of exits. Being confronted by Randy and possibly someone else was no small threat. Randy could arrive as a hired enforcer motivated by money, or as someone personally wounded by Lynette's betrayal. Each possibility carried a different kind of danger. If it was purely business, Randy would be cold and precise, force Lynette to surrender information, documents, or a confession useful as evidence. If emotion was involved, the confrontation became far less predictable because personal hurt often drives people beyond the limits that professional rules impose. The second person pressing Lynette might be Bill, though it could just as easily be someone else trying to silence her. Bill had warned Haley to stay away from Lynette because she was dangerous, but beneath that warning lived another fear. Lynette knew too much, not only about legal dealings, but about family secrets. The irony was sharp. Bill could recognize the darkness in a client like Lynette, yet remain blind or choose blindness toward the signs of something wrong around his own wife. Was it love clouding his judgment, or a form of self-deception where Bill refused to see the pieces that could collapse the family image he needed to maintain status in the community? If Lynette was pushed into a corner, she was not the type to surrender quietly. She was a woman accustomed to surviving by holding other people's secrets like emergency weapons. And she might possess something powerful enough to destroy Haley's marriage or shake Bill's position to its core. At that point, everything becomes a game between the wounded, fighting for the right to remain standing. If Randy and the second threat forced Lynette to choose, she would weigh who was easiest to betray in exchange for her own escape. And if Haley's robbery was not random at all, but carried Lynette's fingerprints, then the story shifts from an isolated incident into a link in a larger chain, where everyone is playing a role they cannot admit. All these lines of tension exist beneath a world coated in the glow of wealth, status, and power. Anita stands at a crossroads of life and death, fighting disease while trying to protect her authority from the pity she despises. Vernon is forced to face the fear of losing his wife, while also confronting how he helped maintain the secrets that pushed her toward the edge. Leslie, after the country club confrontation, may begin to feel the weight of consequence, but she will not easily shed the cruelty that became her only armor against a pride worn down to the bone. Jacob moves deeper into his assignment, forced to accept actions that bend law and morality to preserve cover, unaware that each time he does, he cuts away another piece of who he used to be. Naomi stands at the intersection of too many secrets, forced to choose between speaking and staying silent, between standing with someone and stepping away, between being a clear-eyed lawyer and a vulnerable wife. In that landscape, conspiracy is no longer an abstract idea whispered behind closed doors. It becomes something that drips into daily choices, shaping them quietly from the inside. Each of them, in their own way, is fighting to keep a fragment of control over life, even if the cost is health, marriage, conscience, or freedom. And the most terrifying question may not be whether Anita will survive this new medical crisis, or whether Jacob will complete his infiltration mission, but whether after everything they will still recognize themselves at all. Once anger, fear, and the ache of betrayal have pushed them into decisions they once believed they would never dare to make.